They sat me at the end of the table nearest the kitchen, next to the bin where the catering staff kept dumping dirty napkins all night. My own daughter's engagement party, and I was wedged between a pot plant and a swing door that kept hitting my shoulder every time a waitress walked through. Then my ex-wife's husband stood up, clinked his glass, and said into the microphone, "To the man who raised Fiona from the age of 4, I am so proud to give her away this weekend as her true father." The room erupted. 70 people raised their glasses and looked straight at me. And then the young bloke next to me leaned over to his girlfriend and whispered, just loud enough, "That's the real dad. He owns half of Brisbane." I sat there with my glass of sparkling water. I'd switched to water after the first pour because my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I smiled. I kept smiling the way you learn to smile when you've had 22 years of practice at swallowing things down. My name is Trevor Caldwell. I'm 63 years old. I built a construction and property development company from nothing, and I have sat at worse tables than this one. But nothing in 22 years had quite prepared me for that moment. I drove home along the M1 with the windows down, even though it was a cold July night. The kind of cold that Brisbane people like to pretend doesn't count as real cold, but absolutely does when you're in a dinner jacket with your heart sitting somewhere around your knees. I kept replaying the look on Fiona's face when Jeff finished his speech. She was glowing, genuinely, completely happy. And the man she had looked at when she mouthed "thank you" was not me. I need to go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't make any sense without it. Fiona was 4 years old when her mother and I separated. I know people always say their marriages ended for complicated reasons, and mine was no different. Helen and I had married too young. I was 24 and already running a small concreting crew, working 6 days a week, coming home too tired to be the husband she needed. I don't say that to excuse her. I say it because after 22 years of carrying resentment, I've had to be honest with myself about what I contributed to the wreckage. What I was not was absent. That is the version of the story I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. Fiona used to run to the front door when she heard my ute pull into the driveway. That little sound of her feet on the floorboards, the way she'd hit the door handle with both hands before I even knocked, that is the sound I fell asleep to for years after I lost regular access to her. Not by choice, by the slow, grinding machinery of a family court system that nobody tells you is stacked against fathers who work long hours, even when those long hours are the reason there's food on the table. Helen had met Jeff within 8 months of us separating. He was a financial planner, steady income, flexible hours, the kind of man who could make school pickup on a Tuesday without rearranging 3 subcontractors. I don't hate him for that. I came to understand, eventually, that Fiona needed someone reliable in her day-to-day life, while I was still trying to build something stable enough to offer her more than alternating Saturdays and the occasional school holiday. The courts gave Helen primary custody. I got every second weekend and 1 Wednesday dinner per fortnight. It should have been the foundation of something. It wasn't, because every second weekend began to mean every third weekend, and then every fourth. As the excuses accumulated the way they do a birthday party, a school camp. Fiona wasn't feeling well. Fiona had said she'd rather stay home this week. I kept a journal in those years. Not because I'm the journaling type, I'm a bloke who reads the sports section and goes to bed at 9:30, but because my solicitor told me to document everything. I have 3 exercise books filled with dates and times, and the exact words Helen used when she rang to cancel. I never needed them in court, but I have them. I know what happened. The presents I sent for birthdays and Christmas came back unopened for 3 years running. Helen's explanation, when she deigned to give one, was that Fiona had outgrown that phase and didn't want to receive things from me anymore. Fiona was 7. She was 7 years old and supposedly didn't want birthday presents from her father. I sent them anyway. A cricket set when she turned 8 because she told me once, on one of our Saturday visits, that she wanted to try cricket. A watercolor set when she turned 9 because I'd seen her drawing on a napkin in a cafe and thought she had real talent. A book about Australian birds when she turned 10 because we'd sat together once on my back veranda, and she'd spotted a sulfur-crested cockatoo and asked me 17 questions about it in a row, the way kids do when something genuinely lights them up. All returned. All explained away. The phone calls were worse. Helen would hand Fiona the phone and stand somewhere nearby. I could always tell from the quality of silence, and Fiona would answer in that flat, careful voice that told me she was being monitored. I'd ask about school and she'd say fine. I'd ask about her friends and she'd say fine. I'd ask if she wanted to come down to the coast next weekend, and there would be a pause, and then she'd say she didn't think so. I used to sit in my car in the car park of whatever job site I'd come from and ring her back immediately after hanging up, just to leave a voicemail she might hear alone, just to say without the performance of it that I loved her and I wasn't going anywhere. I don't know if she ever heard those messages. When Fiona was 11, Jeff formally adopted her. Helen had argued, through her solicitor, that this would provide Fiona with stability and a clear sense of family identity. The judge agreed. I sat in that courtroom and signed the paperwork because my own solicitor told me, gently but plainly, that contesting it would extend a legal process that was already damaging Fiona more than helping her, and that at the age of 11, she had expressed a preference. An 11-year-old's preference, shaped by the adults around her, had more legal weight than everything I'd tried to give her over 7 years. I drove straight to a job site after that hearing. Didn't go home. Just pulled up at the Westfield development we were working on at the time. Got out of the car in my good suit and stood watching the excavators for about an hour until one of my foremen came over and asked if everything was all right. I said yes. Then I got back in my car and drove home and cried for 3 hours in my kitchen alone, which is not something I have told anyone before now. After the adoption, the contact dried up almost completely. Fiona would ring on my birthday sometimes, a quick call that felt obligatory, the kind of call you make when you've been reminded to. The last real conversation we had, when she was 13, she said to me, clearly and without cruelty, but without warmth, "Jeff's my dad now. I don't really know why we keep doing this," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. "I know, love. I just want you to know, I'm here, if you ever need me." She said okay. And that was mostly that. I didn't disappear. I want to be clear about that. I didn't move away or change my number or stop thinking about her for a single day in the next decade. But I also made the decision, and it was the hardest decision I've ever made. And I stand by it still, to stop pursuing contact that was making her uncomfortable. Some love has to be expressed by letting go, by choosing someone else's peace over your own need to be present. What I did instead was build. It wasn't a calculated thing. What I built. It wasn't a plan for revenge or some long game I was playing. I was just a man who poured everything he had nowhere else to put into work. Caldwell Construction became Caldwell Group. I moved into property development, then commercial real estate, then a hospitality arm that started with one boutique hotel in the valley and grew to 6 properties across Queensland. I diversified because I found I was good at it, and because staying busy was the closest thing I had to peace. By my mid-50s, I had a business manager named Janet, who had been with me for 15 years, and who I suspect knew more about my emotional life than I did. I had a corner office in a building I owned. I had a small apartment in New Farm, with a view of the river that I genuinely loved, and I had a daughter whose Instagram account I followed anonymously, whose milestones I watched from the same distance I'd watched everything else. I knew she'd studied communications at Quat. I knew she'd started working at a PR firm in the city. I knew she'd been with a bloke named Kyle for 4 years before they got engaged, because the engagement announcement appeared on her feed one Tuesday morning, and I sat in my office for a long time before I could bring myself to send a congratulatory text. She replied 2 hours later, "Thanks, Dad. Hope you're well." Dad. Not the dad who'd raised her. Not Jeff. But also not her father. Just Dad, in the loose, uncertain way you use a word when you're not quite sure what it means anymore. I was invited to the engagement party. The invitation came through the mail, not through a phone call, cream envelope, with a return address in Paddington that I didn't recognize. My name was printed on the front in someone else's handwriting, Kyle's. I'd later learn because Fiona had asked him to address the envelopes and hadn't been able to bring herself to write mine herself. There was no personal note inside, just the details, the date, the venue, the RSVP. I almost didn't go. I talked it over with Janet, who has 3 adult daughters and a husband she's been married to for 30 years, and who I trust more than my own judgment on most human matters. She said, very simply, if you don't go, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you did. So I went. I drove home from that party knowing something I hadn't known before. Not about Fiona, but about myself. The humiliation of that seat, the swing door hitting my shoulder, the speech about the father she never had, none of it had broken me. And that meant something. That meant 22 years of quiet love had made me more solid than I'd realized. 3 days later, I was at my desk at 7 in the morning when Janet knocked on the door. "You have a visitor," she said. And her voice had a quality to it that told me she knew exactly who was standing in the reception area. Fiona was 30 years old. She was taller than I remembered. I'd last seen her properly when she was 12, and she had Helen's coloring and, though I'd never have said it aloud, my mother's hands. She was holding a shoebox, and she looked like she hadn't slept. "I found some things," she said. "At Mum's." When I was helping her sort through the spare room, she put the shoebox on my desk. Inside were the birthday presents. Not all of them. The cricket set was too big, I assume, and some things probably hadn't survived the intervening years, but the watercolor set and the book about Australian birds and a small framed photograph I had sent when she was 6, a photo of the 2 of us at the Lone Pine Koala Sanctuary. Her laughing at something I'd said. My arm around her shoulders. And letters. Dozens of them, bundled with a rubber band that had gone brittle and snapped when she'd opened the box. Letters I had written every few weeks for years, and then every few months, and then a few times a year until she was 18. I hadn't been certain Helen was keeping them, but I'd kept writing because I needed to believe someone was. "I didn't know," Fiona said. She was not crying. She seemed past crying, into something harder and more still. "I thought you stopped. Mum always said you'd moved on. I never stopped. I can see that." She sat down in the chair across from my desk, the chair where I usually had contractor meetings. Nothing personal about it, but she sat in it like she intended to stay. And she said, "I need you to tell me everything. From your side. I want to know what actually happened." So I told her. I talked for nearly 2 hours. I told her about the exercise books and the court hearings, and the presents returned unopened, and the voicemails I'd left hoping she might hear them alone. I told her about standing at the back of the crowd at her Year 12 formal, just to see her in her dress, slipping away before she could spot me. I told her about the anonymous Instagram account, which made her laugh a surprised, startled laugh, and I told her about the Tuesday morning when her engagement announcement came up on my screen. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. "Jeff's not a bad person," she said finally. "I know he's not. He loves me. He was there. I know, but he's not." She stopped, started again. "I've been having these memories since I found the box. Things I thought I'd forgotten. You used to do this thing where you'd make up completely wrong names for animals to make me laugh. We'd be at the zoo and you'd point at a giraffe and say, 'Look at that enormous spotty dog.' I had forgotten that. The memory came back so cleanly it was almost physical. 'You called the emos confused ostriches,' I said." She laughed again. Properly this time. And I thought, there it is. There's the kid who used to run to the front door. Over the weeks that followed, We began the slow work of getting to know each other again. There is no shortcut for this. You cannot compress 22 years of absence into a few heartfelt conversations and call it resolved. We had coffee once a week, then dinner once a fortnight. Sometimes Kyle came, which helped. He's a straightforward, decent young bloke who had apparently been quietly encouraging Fiona to reach out for months before she found the shoebox. I told her about the business, about how it had grown, about the years when it was the only thing keeping me sane. She told me about QUT, about the PR firm, about a promotion she'd been passed over for twice and had finally got the third time around. It was during one of those dinners that she asked me about the engagement party venue, the Arbor Function Center, she said. Mum chose it. She said she'd gotten a really good rate. She would have, I said. And then I had to tell her. The Arbor was one of 6 function venues that had come with a hospitality group I'd acquired 4 years earlier. Helen hadn't known that when she'd booked it had, in fact, negotiated with the events coordinator with her usual brisk efficiency, pleased with herself for getting a discount on the weekend rate. The discount existed because Fiona had, at some point in the booking process, mentioned to the coordinator that her mother was a returning client from a previous corporate function. Returning clients received a 15% reduction. That policy existed because I'd implemented it when I took over the group. Fiona stared at me for a long moment. You paid for your own humiliation. I didn't know it was your party when the booking came in, but you paid for the swing door and the dirty napkins and the table next to the kitchen. Technically, yes. She put her fork down. She was quiet for a moment, and then she started laughing. Really laughing. The uncontrollable kind, and I found myself laughing too, which was not what I'd expected. Sometimes the absurdity of things is the only response left. Later that night, she asked me something harder. Did you know Jeff's financial planning practice was struggling about 10 years ago? I did know. Because Jeff's practice had, a decade ago, been absorbed into a financial services firm that was now a subsidiary of Caldwell Group. He was still running his client book, still carried his own business cards with his own name on them, had no reason to know that the firm's operational costs were partially underwritten by a holding company I controlled. His income had stabilized. His super contributions had been matched at a higher rate than the standard arrangement. He had never questioned any of it. I explained this to Fiona carefully. She was quiet for longer this time. He doesn't know? No. Are you going to tell him? I've been thinking about that. She looked out the window of the restaurant at the river below. He's a good person, she said again. He believed what Mum told him. He thought you weren't interested. I know. He's not a villain. He's the man who raised my daughter, I said. I don't think of him as a villain. We sat with that for a while. Helen was harder to reach and harder to forgive. But I had not built a business by avoiding difficult conversations. Fiona arranged for the 3 of us to meet at a cafe in Newstead Neutral Territory. Fiona's choice, which I respected. Helen looked older than I expected, which was unfair of me since I certainly did too. And she looked frightened in a way I hadn't anticipated. I didn't come to that meeting with a list of grievances. I had spent 30 years rehearsing that list in my head, and I had finally, sometime around my 60th birthday, put it down. What I said to Helen was this: I'm not here to revisit everything. I'm here because Fiona wants a relationship with me, and I want to make sure that doesn't cost her the relationship she has with you. Helen cried. She said she'd convinced herself, over the years, that she'd been protecting Fiona, that she'd been afraid, in those early years, that divided loyalties would damage a child who'd already been through too much change, that she'd watched Fiona settle and thrive, and had justified each small deception by pointing to the outcome. She did thrive, I said. That's true. I'm sorry, Trevor. I accepted that. Not easily. Not all at once. But I accepted it, because holding on to it would cost me the years I had left with my daughter. and I had already given too many years to that particular expense. The wedding itself, the actual wedding, 6 months after the engagement party, was a different occasion entirely. Fiona asked me to do a reading during the ceremony, not to walk her down the aisle. She and Kyle had decided to walk in together, which suited me fine, and I suspect was Fiona's way of not having to choose between me and Jeff. But a reading, something meaningful, something that required me to stand at the front of the room and be present as her father in a way I had never publicly been before. I chose a passage from a letter I'd written to her when she was 9, which she'd found in the shoebox and had asked if she could keep. I read it to the room of 80 guests, my voice steadier than I expected. Fiona cried. Kyle, Janet, who had been invited and had driven up from the Gold Coast specifically for the occasion, cried loudly enough that the people around her turned to look. Jeff shook my hand afterwards. He said, "I owe you an apology. I believed things I should have questioned." I told him he'd been lied to the same as Fiona had, and that wasn't on him. We didn't hug, but we shook hands like men who respected each other's place in the same story, which was more than I dared hope for. The moment I've thought about most, since that day, was not the reading or the handshake, or even the look on Fiona's face when I walked through the doors of the reception venue and she crossed the room to take my arm. It was later in the evening, after the speeches, when Fiona and I were standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching Kyle dance badly and enthusiastically with her university friends. She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder, a gesture so small it might have meant nothing, and said, "I'm glad you came to the engagement party, even with the swing door." I said, "I'd have sat next to 10 swing doors." She said, "I know. I think I always knew. Somewhere. I just didn't have the words for it. There is no clean ending to a story like this one. Fiona and I are still learning each other, still finding the edges of what we are to each other. Now that we are both adults, and the old architecture of the relationship, father and small child, protection running one way has given way to something more equal, more uncertain, and more honest. We don't have the easy shorthand of people who've shared 20 years of dinners and inside jokes and small daily habits. We have something different. We have chosen each other, deliberately, as adults, with full knowledge of the gap and the cost of it. That is not nothing. In some ways, it is more solid than a relationship built only on time. I have learned some things from all of this that I want to say plainly, because I think they matter. The first is that love expressed without recognition is still love. I wrote to my daughter for years and heard nothing back. Those letters were not wasted. They were seeds in soil I couldn't see. And eventually they grew. The second is that the truth has a way of surfacing. Not quickly, not without cost. But it does surface if someone is honest enough to look for it. Fiona found that shoebox because she went looking. Not every child does. But if you have kept telling your truth through letters, through voicemails, through showing up even when showing up hurts, then there is something there to find. The third is harder to say, but I believe it. Forgiving someone for causing you harm is not the same as excusing what they did. I have forgiven Helen. I have not pretended she didn't do what she did. Both things can be true. And holding both of them is the only way I've found to actually move forward, rather than just performing the idea of it. And the last thing is this. To anyone who is where I was 20 years ago, who is being edged out of a child's life, who is sending presents into silence, who is showing up to events where they've been placed next to the kitchen bins, I would say, do not stop. Keep the record. Write the letters. Leave the voicemails. Build something. Not for revenge. Not so that one day you can show them what they missed. Build something because you are still a person with value outside of this particular wound, and because the life you build while you're waiting might, one day, be part of the story that brings your child back to you. It was for me. Thank you for listening to this. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. If you're in Melbourne, Cairns, Perth, somewhere in between, drop it in the comments below. And if any part of this story rang true for you, I'd be glad to hear that too. I've thought a lot, in the years since all of this unfolded, about what actually caused things to go the way they did. Not in a bitter way. More in the way you sit on a back veranda at the end of a long day and just look at things clearly. The truth is, everything Helen built on deception, the careful story she told Fiona about who I was and wasn't, the presents quietly returned, the letters kept in a shoebox instead of handed over, all of it eventually collapsed under its own weight. Not because anyone went looking for justice, because Fiona went looking for a spare room. That's the thing about deception. It doesn't require a dramatic unmasking. It just requires enough time and a daughter willing to open a box with her name on it. I used to think the worst thing that happened to me was losing those years with Fiona. I don't think that anymore. The worst thing would have been becoming bitter because of them. I came close. There were years in my 50s when I'd drive past a school and feel something so heavy I'd have to turn the radio up just to get through the rest of the day. That kind of grief, if you let it sit long enough without doing anything with it, turns into something that doesn't just hurt you, it makes you smaller, harder, less capable of being the person your child might one day want to find. What saved me, I think, was the decision to keep building anyway. Not for revenge, not to prove a point, just because a person needs something to put their hands to, and I chose to put mine to something real. Caldwell Group became what it became because I had nowhere else to put 20 years of love that had nowhere to go. That's not noble, that's just what happened. But the byproduct of it was that when Fiona finally found her way back to me, I was still standing. I hadn't collapsed inward. I had something to show her. Not to impress her, she couldn't have cared less about the buildings, but to show her that the man she'd been told had walked away had, in fact, been here the whole time. Jeff is not a bad man. I want to say that again because I think it matters. He raised my daughter with love and consistency, and she is the person she is partly because of him. The deception he participated in was a deception he didn't know he was part of. That distinction is worth making. Holding him responsible for what Helen chose to do would have been easier than examining the situation honestly, and it would have been wrong. Forgiving Helen took longer. I won't pretend otherwise. But I've come to believe that people who cause harm in the name of protection are not usually monsters. They're usually just frightened. Helen was frightened of losing Fiona to divided loyalties. She made choices I'll never excuse, but I understand them now in a way I couldn't at 35. Understanding someone's fear doesn't mean agreeing with what they did with it. It just means you're not carrying their fear on top of your own anymore, which is a lighter way to live. If I could say anything to a younger version of myself, sitting in that car park after a canceled weekend visit, writing dates in an exercise book, it would be this: the letters matter. Write them, even if they come back. The record you keep when no one is watching is the most honest thing about you. And one day, someone might read it and finally understand who you actually were. That's what Fiona found in that shoebox. Not evidence. Just her father, still trying.